Welcome to Security and GRC Decoded, the podcast where security, governance, risk, and compliance professionals, CISOs, executive leaders, and practitioners can stay ahead of industry trends and challenges. I'm your host, Raj Krishnamurthy, founder of ComplianceCow. Join us twice a month to bring you expert insights, actionable strategies, and real-world stories to elevate your security, governance, risk, and compliance programs. Each week, we decode the complexities of GRC to help you make smarter decisions and drive innovation in your organization. Let's dive into today's conversation. Welcome.
Hey. Welcome to Security and GRC Decoded. I'm Raj Krishnamurthy, your host, and today we have the awesome Walter Haydock as our guest today. Walter is the CEO of StackAware and is a practitioner and is a well-known figure in the AI security governance, risk, and privacy space. Let's decode. Walter, welcome.
Thanks a lot. Really appreciate you having me on, Raj.
No, just say thank you very much, Walter. So let me, I'm going to start with something. Let me ask you something controversial. What do you think of, I don't know if it is controversial. What do you think of DeepSeek and how do you think companies should react to it?
Yeah, so I think there are three key takeaways from a security and compliance perspective. So the first would be the origins of DeepSeek in terms of the intellectual property that was used to develop it. The second would be the implications of using DeepSeek, specifically the SaaS version, just looking at the terms and conditions, the privacy policy. And then the third would be, looking at the failure modes of DeepSeek, specifically the SaaS version, which I think there's been some recent news on. So I'll tackle that in three parts. So on the first piece, I think it's interesting that OpenAI is alleging or suggesting that some of their intellectual property was used to train the model. And, it's certainly possible that that happened. I mean, every piece of technology is going to build off additional or predecessors. And really, it's a question of how closely are they matching those predecessors? And, I'll leave that for the lawyers. But, certainly from a cybersecurity perspective, it's important to protect your intellectual property, make sure that you have mechanisms to prevent others from using it for their commercial gain. The second piece would be looking at the use of the SaaS version of DeepSeek in its intended approach. So first of all, it trains by default on all the prompts that you give it, and they had some very interesting language in the terms of service that said something like, only to a minor degree will we improve our product based on your prompts. I'm not really sure what that means. So I would basically expect that all your data is being trained on if you're submitting it to the SaaS version. And then also, their data is stored in China, so that China has different laws regarding what the government can do, gaining access, how they can leverage that data. So that's something very important to keep in mind. And China has a pretty serious history of stealing intellectual property and forcing its technology companies to assist in that process. So that's the second consideration. And then the third consideration is a failure mode of using the DeepSeek SaaS application, which Wiz recently released a report, which I think they called Deep Leak, showing that a lot of the back-end infrastructure was actually exposed to the internet, and they could pull out unencrypted prompts and things like that from the DeepSeek infrastructure. So that's the general approach or top three issues I would call out from looking at DeepSeek. And there are a lot of layers and layers of considerations below that, but that's my take.
Got it. The platform has been down. I was trying to do this yesterday and the day before. I keep getting these 503s, and I saw the post as well. But do you see, especially the open source model, do you see the likes of AWS and Azure Bedrock sort of embracing these models anytime soon?
Potentially, yes. I mean, on the open source side of things, that's a little grayer. For me, using the SaaS version, I would advise any of my customers just don't do it. It's just That would be an unacceptable risk unless you have like a completely public use case, like unless you're using it as my best example is like if you're using it as a meme or a joke generator, yeah, okay, that's fine. If you are fine with 100% of your content being public and being trained on, then okay, go for it. But for the vast majority of customers, that's not the case. For the open source version, it's a little more nuanced because of the power of DeepSeek, like, the capabilities of the model and the fact that it is free to use. That is a huge potential business advantage. A key thing to look at is if it's doing any sort of callbacks or, there's any telemetry that the open source is trying to send back to the model trainers and developers. That would be important to look at. And then, potentially in some circumstances, I could see the risk reward making sense for some companies if they're confident that they can prevent any sort of data callbacks to DeepSeek, the company. Then it's possible that it could make sense, and maybe some of the major hyperscale cloud providers will offer it, in their kind of platform as a service offerings like Bedrock that you mentioned. And I could see it. There's certainly other considerations like intellectual property. If OpenAI somehow, wins some sort of judgment and gets them to essentially pull down that model or change the licensing, that could be a risk as well.
Got it. Thank you very much, Walter. Now let's talk about you. How did you get started on security GRC and why the focus on AI?
Yeah, so I've been in the security world since, I started my career. I was just in a different type of security. I was in the physical security game as a Marine Corps officer. And then the cyber aspect of conflict, I was an intelligence officer of intelligence collection, became, increasingly apparent how important it was. And over time, I reskilled, I upskilled, learned more about the cybersecurity compliance world. And actually, my first professional experience with it was working on Capitol Hill, where I was a staff member for the House Homeland Security Committee, overseeing what is now the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It wasn't called that when I was there. So really developed an appreciation for the importance of cybersecurity for U.S. national security, and decided I wanted to pivot into the private sector. Did that. I worked at a big company as a product security guy for a couple years, kind of cut my teeth in the private sector to learn how things worked, how software development ran, and then worked at a security specific vendor, also as a product manager after that. And then in 2022, decided to start my own company and actually did a pretty hard pivot for StackAware. We started as a vulnerability management platform. And in fact, StackAware, we still use our vulnerability management tooling internally, but we don't sell it anymore because there just wasn't a market demand for it. With that said, at the end of 22, with the launch of ChatGPT, there was an explosion in interest in artificial intelligence. And actually, previously in my in my career, I had been on the fence about whether I wanted to go more the data science route or be on the security side of things. So I had an interest there and saw that there was a lot of fear, uncertainty, doubt about AI out there, and thought that there was an opportunity to fill that void with a services-based approach. So changed the delivery method and the subject matter of StackAware in 2023, and we've been cruising along on that focus since then, and it's been going well.
Oh, fantastic to hear. What is your view of security, governance, risk, compliance, and privacy, and the intersection of that with AI? What is your view on that?
Yeah, it's a broad topic, and I guess I earn my living trying to answer that question. None of the fundamentals change, in my opinion. You need to understand what is your risk appetite based on business considerations, based on regulatory considerations, ethical considerations. You need to establish that before you really do anything else. And then you can build your GRC program around your risk appetite to ensure that you stay within it. And AI presents a lot of opportunities to exceed your risk appetite in unanticipated ways because, as I mentioned, that fear, uncertainty, and doubt out there where folks have difficulty wrapping their heads around how these systems work. And they're not magic, but some folks do interpret them or treat them as if they are magic. Recently, I saw, a gentleman, he mentioned, that as soon as you provide information to any AI system, it's no longer confidential. And that's not necessarily true. There are plenty of SaaS AI tools that have done a pretty good job of maintaining confidentiality, and they're not entirely different from normal information systems. There are nuances. For example, ChatGPT and DeepSeek by default train on their inputs. So that's an important consideration. And, I went back and forth with this gentleman, and then he kind of corrected himself. He said, well, anything that you find on the App Store is not necessarily, going to protect your confidentiality, which is also not true. Like, you can get the ChatGPT team version on the App Store. You need to pay a subscription for it, but they have guarantees of confidentiality. They don't train on your data. There are some nuances in terms of retention, but it's a complex topic, and AI adds a wrinkle to it that certainly is worth investing in and learning about, but the fundamentals still apply.
Okay, got it. And Mark Anderson, I think initially, if you remember, he said software is eating the world. He has changed that tune to AI is eating the world. And how do you see, and especially as organizations embrace this, how do you see AI governance fitting into the larger GRCP strategy for any company? What would your advice be?
Yeah, I think that will be an interesting question. So I wrote an article about this, how there are basically 5 people or groups who can lead AI governance efforts. There are security teams, which I think have taken the lead right now. That's the primary point of contact between StackAware and its customers are security teams. There are privacy teams who are a little more focused on the regulatory aspects. They're focused on protection of individual personal data. They're less concerned about intellectual property and safeguarding that. There are legal teams who obviously focused on legal risk. They're focused on intellectual property assignment. They're focused on contractual restrictions. There's some argument for them being in charge. There are the data scientists and AI engineers themselves, potentially. They're the most technically capable. They're going to understand the capabilities of AI systems the best. But, having them manage the risk may not be the best idea because they're going to be more focused on the business outcome. And then there's a possibility that an AI governance specific function will develop. And that has pluses and minuses. Pluses are that there's kind of no conflict of interest. It's focused on one narrow problem. Some of the minuses are that it adds overhead, adds more people at the table. But I have certainly seen organizations establish AI governance functions, and they're full-time employees who are just AI governance professionals. So that's certainly an option. And, it remains to be seen what the best way to do it is. My recommendation is, have somebody lead the risk advisory and management efforts, and then have that person be separate from the business owner who's actually making the risk decisions. So there should be an advisor and an implementer, and then there should be a decider. And whoever the advisor is should not be the business leader, because that would essentially it would remove an external check, or not a check, but an external source of advice, kind of a neutral source of advice from the business leader. And then conversely, the security leader should not be making decisions because, that's not how business works. And, if we wanted to be super secure, we would just shut everything down and delete all our computers.
Got it. No, and then the separation of duties, as you rightly put it, also gives you a check and balance, right, in this. What do you think broadly is happening in the industry today around security, GRC, privacy, and AI governance?
There's been a heavy push from AI security specific vendors. And, that's fine. Like, I think that and StackAware is one of them. Specifically on the tooling side, there are unique considerations for AI, some wrinkles that I mentioned, and there's certainly going to be a need for technical solutions to some of these problems. I think that the vast majority of problems in security are more on the process, on the kind of risk assessment side of things than they are technical problems. Like the technical solutions that we have available are pretty amazing. The key is just making sure that they're applied correctly, that they that we're doing using these tools consistently. So I think we still have a way to go in terms of frameworks for managing AI risk. And once we nail those, then the technical solution, the product focused people can be more impactful. They're certainly developing good technologies, but making sure that we're using them in the right context that's going to be the most important thing.
Got it. And I know that you co-authored the High Trust AI Governance Framework. Am I right? Or what is your role in that world?
Yeah, so I didn't co-author it. I would certainly not claim that. I was a major commentator on it. I worked with the High Trust organization on the AI security certification. So yeah, they authored it. They took a ton of feedback from a huge slew of industry and kind of public policy people, and they put that out at the end of last year. There are no currently certified organizations. I am working. This is a public thing I could say. I'm working with one of my customers, Embold Health, to pursue the High Trust AI security certification. So we are working on that as we speak. And that is a very narrowly tailored framework. It is specific to security. It doesn't tackle responsible AI. It doesn't tackle transparency. It doesn't tackle ethics. It doesn't tackle unlawful or undesirable bias. It only focuses on security, which I think is a benefit because it's very clear about where it begins and ends, and it gives a set of firm requirements that companies need to meet. And it's probably the most specific and it is a specification. It's the most specific specification that I've seen, which you can contrast to something like ISO 42001, which is way higher level, much more broadly focused. It includes security and privacy, but it also has a bunch of other things like transparency, data provenance, those types of things.
Talking of ISO 42001, how was it to get ISO 42001 for StackAware, and what challenges did you face?
Yeah, so StackAware was ISO 42001 certified at the end of 2024, in October of 2024. And it was a challenge because it was a new framework, and we were actually only the second company that our auditor had been going through in the process. So we were learning a lot along the way about, what are the requirements of AI impact assessments. Like 42001 talks about them, gives some recommendations, but it doesn't give you an example AI impact assessment. Also, the document that specifically lays out how to do AI impact assessments, ISO 42005, is still in draft. It's not been approved yet. So figuring that out was certainly interesting. Understanding the scope of the AI management system, would we include third-party systems, which we did because StackAware doesn't build any proprietary models. We don't even fine-tune any models right now. Figuring out the scope was important. And yeah, figuring out how to present the information to auditors was certainly something to work through. So eventually we settled on a way where, essentially we would give them access to our Google Drive to see certain things. StackAware makes most of its AI management system publicly available, but some things we obviously can't, like our risk register. So we found out a way to provide essentially role-based access, if you will, to the auditor so that they could see the inner workings of our AI management system.
Got it. And for folks who are not familiar with ISO 42001, how should they think about 42001, why should they think about getting 42001 certified? Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll get right to the kind of what's in it for me side of things. Is 42001 is almost unique in that there are already laws on the books, for example, in Colorado, that specifically state if you are ISO 42001 compliant, you will get safe harbor under certain provisions of like Colorado's AI Act. So that's one example. This hasn't been finalized yet and it hasn't been confirmed, but I predict that ISO 42001 will become what is known as a harmonized standard under the European Union AI Act. And what that means is if you are in compliance with this 42001 standard, you will have a presumption of conformity with certain provisions of the AI Act. Now, again, that hasn't been finalized. That's my prediction about how it will turn out. So those are two quick benefits. More broadly, 42001 gives you a system for complying with AI-related data privacy, cybersecurity regulation. It gives you a way to develop an AI governance program for your organization that looks at, responsible AI architecture, looks at data provenance, quality, bias, all these things that are key to developing safe, effective, and responsible artificial intelligence systems. So most importantly is 42001 tells you how to build an AI management system and gives you a process for managing AI-related risk.
Got it. And how do you think practitioners should react to these changes that you're talking about, and how should they adapt to these challenges?
Yeah. So from a regulatory perspective, the laws are quickly piling up. So I mentioned Colorado in the United States. New York City has its own local level law about artificial intelligence, specifically as it relates to hiring. Texas is developing a very comprehensive responsible AI governance act. It hasn't passed yet, but it's in process right now. So there's a big slew of regulations that are coming. There are a whole set of threat vectors that are coming. Things that were not on the radar of security professionals previously: data poisoning, sensitive data generation, unintended training from AI systems. These are things that are new on the radar of a lot of security teams. So understanding how your data can be impacted and making sure that you have a flexible compliance program that can identify these risks, whether they be technical, regulatory, what have you, is going to be really critical for companies that want to prosper in the coming decade or so.
Got it. Hey, you talked about the emergence of AI governance, and you sort of articulated the security risk side and compliance side of it as well. How do you build a program? If somebody is going to ask you, what would your advice be?
Yeah, I would recommend starting with a framework. So the two most popular ones would be the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, which is a U.S. Essentially government standard. It's mandatory for the U.S. government. It's not mandatory for anyone else. There's no way you can be certified on it, but it does provide a series of high-level recommendations for how to structure your governance program. That is certainly one option especially for US-based organizations. That could be a good approach if you don't need a formal external certification. The second one would be ISO 42001, which we discussed. A key piece of 42001 is that it matches up relatively well with ISO 27001, which is an information security management system standard, and even ISO 27701, which is a privacy information management system. So if you have a whole host of kind of regulatory compliance requirements, using either of those as your basis is a good idea. And then on the NIST side, you can also tie up the AI RMF with the NIST cybersecurity framework and the NIST privacy framework. So both systems, kind of the US-based one under NIST or the international one based on ISO, give you a good place to start. The key is implementation. Both of these frameworks are high level. So the key is implementation. Like, how are you actually going to achieve the objectives?
And we're talking of implementation, how can we use AI towards this implementation? Any ideas, suggestions?
Yeah. I mean, StackAware obviously, uses AI heavily. We make sure that, all of our customer data is not being trained on, that it's not being indefinitely retained. Those are types of things that are top of mind. But with those safeguards in place, we can then use artificial intelligence to do a lot of cool stuff. For example, using it to brainstorm about potential threat vectors. That's a great use of the tool. You can summarize meeting notes and, pull out key risks that maybe you hadn't thought about when you were in the moment. Maybe looking at it after the fact, you have a better understanding of your risk surface. You can also use it on a technical level. You can, security operations centers. There are tons of AI SOC startups out there that are automating a lot of the detection and response to potentially malicious actors. It's useful in vulnerability management. The exploit prediction scoring system, that's a predictive AI tool, leverages a proprietary formula that's trained on a lot of vendor data that these vendors provide for free to the organization, the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams. So AI is both a force multiplier for security teams, and it can be a challenge for security teams. The key is understanding how to use it securely and responsibly.
Got it. And on EPSS, Walter, it's a 30-day exploit probability model, right?
Yep.
Is there an open source model? Because EPSS model is not open. It's open to use, but the model itself, it's not open, right? Is there a model that is coming up?
Yes, the EPSS model is not open source. The outputs of the model are open source. And essentially, First is running like a free SaaS app in the fact that they are hosting the EPSS model and make available an API to call its result, to produce its results. But no, there is no open source model, to my understanding, that does the same. And that is primarily because the sensitivity, I believe it's because of the sensitivity of the data. Essentially, the inputs to the EPSS are attempted exploitation events. And there are some concerns about the providers of that data, about potentially exposing that. Obviously, they go through a lot of security controls like anonymization. They strip off, IP addresses associated with these exploitation attempts. But, there's still concerns that you don't want to open it up too much and then have that turn into a vulnerability itself.
Got it. For practitioners who are thinking about setting up the governance, AI GRCP model that you talked about, I think one of the challenges is that they have to build a case to establish this to their leadership. Any advice in terms of how our listeners can effectively build a business case or take this to their leadership?
Yeah, I'd say there are three broad buckets of risk that businesses are focused on. And it depends on what type of business it is. But specific to AI, basically the first risk is confidentiality risk. Like, are we leaking sensitive information to third parties? That's a big risk that some are primarily focused on. More B2C companies are focused on reputation risk, about somebody abusing a chatbot, getting it to agree to something or say something that damages us or even obligates us contractually, which is possible, as we've seen from, there's an incident with Air Canada where someone essentially got that chatbot to tell him something about the refund policy, which didn't end up to be true. And then that person sued Air Canada and won and forced Air Canada to perform what its chatbot said it would do. And then the third kind of risk that people are focused on is essentially litigation. They're worried about being sued for using or training on data or using the products that have been trained on certain types of data. And different organizations have different concerns, but generally they fall within those three buckets. And I would pick whatever bucket is most salient to the organization and then, do a deep dive and present that to your leadership and say, here are the risks, here's what's happened, here's what could happen. Here's my assessment on the probability and impact. And, as a business leader, what do you think we should do?
Okay. And for somebody who's inheriting a program with some pieces of it existing or maybe not, is your advice going to be any different? Are there things that they can specifically do if they're inheriting a program?
I would say that the general approach is the same. If you're taking over, a brownfield program, so to speak, rather than building it from scratch, your approach may need to be different because there'll be different business units that have certain interests, certain equities that you'll need to respect. So getting the lay of the land, understanding what the priorities of the various business units are, and then aligning your recommendations around those would be my biggest proposal. And that's true for a greenfield program, but for a greenfield program, you'll have more opportunity to shape that conversation than you would if you are just coming in from, on top of an existing program.
Got it. Are you seeing any innovations in this space as you look ahead?
Yeah. So specifically from an AI governance perspective or just an AI perspective that has governance implications?
AI governance perspective would be a good start, and then you can generally talk about what you're seeing around the AI perspective as well.
Yeah. So I think having the existing GRC automation state-of-the-art catch up is going to be important. I know there are some GRC providers that offer ISO 42001 modules with them. There are, like I said, the technical security tools that attack AI-specific risks. I think the autonomous SOCs will be, will eventually be able to alleviate a lot of the burden on security teams.
SOCs here as in SOC.
SOC, Security Operations Centers. Yeah. Yes. Not Sarbanes-Oxley or systems and organization controls. So many acronyms. Acronyms. Yes. So those I see the biggest innovations, potentially agentic security or governance AI. So you can have AI systems that are interacting with other systems that are autonomously enforcing your policies, procedures, regulatory requirements, things like that internally, I could see. And then on the flip side, agentic AI from just a business perspective is going to be a huge risk surface, massive risk surface. So, another a red line that I would say with very few exceptions is like I would advise all of my clients do not enable the computer control capabilities of Anthropic right now. You just don't know what the agent is going to do right now, and it's too risky unless you have a very locked down system that there's no way that it can access sensitive data, it can't corrupt anything, it can't embarrass you. Only if you have those very controlled circumstances would I say is it appropriate. So agentic AI, maybe a step back from that, something that is talking to another system. That's where, there's a lot of business value there, but there's also a lot of risk because we're going to need to rethink what it means to be secure because AI agents are going to make mistakes. It's just going to happen. They're just going to do something that's wrong. And business leaders need to understand that and kind of understand what their risk appetite is. And then the security teams can implement the controls that crank down on the functionality or open up on the functionality as decided by the business.
And how long do you think security and GRC teams have time? What is your time horizon prediction?
They have negative time. They're behind. They're behind already. They're always behind.
Okay.
I mean, it's kind of impossible for them to not be behind because there's nothing to secure until business and technology leaders invent something, and then you need to secure it. So obviously baking in security from the beginning is an important approach, and that's something I'm a big fan of. It's always challenging to do if you're trying to iterate quickly and you're trying to get a prototype out there. It's good that security teams have threat modeling sessions and review and code reviews and things like that. Those are absolutely important. But until there's something to review, there's nothing to review. So security is just always going to be at least one step behind the business, and they should get involved and get up front with the business as much as they can. But at the same time, understand that the business is going to need to do things at a certain pace and just be prepared for it.
What would you tell the younger self, right, or for a new person who's entering this field, especially the Security GRC program right now?
I would say focus on hands-on learning, focus on developing skills through projects. I mean, courses are great, certifications are great. I've got tons of certifications, like they were good frameworks, but you're still going to have to learn a certain tool, like get really good at a certain tool, figure out a certain tool and focus on that, because there's going to be increasing demand for highly specialized people who can outperform AI in certain contexts. There's going to be less demand for people who are kind of like generally knowledgeable about high-level security concepts, like, ChatGPT can probably pass the CISP exam right now. So that's not going to be a huge distinguishing mark for you to have a CISP. I say that having a CISP myself, like I think being highly skilled in a certain tool is going to be very important, and focus less on credentials. That would be my advice.
Okay, that's great advice. We are almost approaching the end of the program, Walter, and I would love to get your perspectives. Are there podcasts, audio books you read, that you listen, or mentors that you look up to, follow? Anything that you can share with our listeners today?
Yeah. So somebody who I follow closely on the AI governance side is Tristan Broth. He's he's pretty active on LinkedIn. I follow Chris Hughes on LinkedIn quite a bit. I'm actually reviewing a draft for a book for someone right now that I also think is good, but I don't know if he wants me to plug it publicly yet, so I will hold off. But I may follow up and send it to you for the show notes if he says it's okay. So that's going to be an interesting book. And so those are my biggest recommendations. I think that the availability of information is just continuously increasing, and there's kind of a lot of, garbage out there or a lot of very high level fluff out there. So find the folks who are writing about or speaking about the very specific use cases that you're focused on, to I would say to your audience, and listen to everything that they have, listen to every piece of information that they can provide, because, they're going to be some leaders out there who can see the future.
I think that's fantastic advice. And on that note, Walter, this was a great discussion. Great having you as a guest. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Raj.
Thank you for listening to Security and GRC Decoded. We are your go-to resource for staying ahead in governance, risk, and compliance. If today's episode resonated with you, we would love for you to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network. To dive deeper into these topics, visit us at ComplianceCow.com and follow us on LinkedIn for more insights and community conversations. Join us next time as we continue decoding the future of GRC. Thank you.